So I'm going to give a short introduction, sort of set the scene. And then we've got a wonderful panel who will be individually introduced a little later. But they cover all aspects of the value chain, preclinical, clinical, data, market access, and such. So this is about how to build an integrated evidence plan when you get to BLA. So, because as it's turning out now that the regulators are your speed bump, your payers are your hurdle. So as you have an accelerated program, which a lot of you will have, you have less time, fewer patients, less data per patient. So you have a wonderful, rapid, accelerated clinical data package, which means you have a whole lot less information to discuss payers and setting your price. The big problem is you're sort of setting your price before you understand what your therapy is, or you have minimal understanding of your therapy. So that's sort of the background, which means there's a lot of implications in that, and the panel will discuss a lot of those. But, during your development and when you're on the market, there's a lot of different stakeholders, and each of these stakeholders is looking for something different. Obviously, everybody wants safety, efficacy, durability. But then the divergence happens, and you have to prepare for each and every one of them. Obviously, patients want something that they can get. Access is always going to be a large problem, but also something they can afford. But when you come down to it, the regulators are going to demand a lot of things, and then the payers are going to demand a lot of other things. And you need to be prepared when you file your BLA. Right? And we'll discuss some of those things in introduction on how to do some of these. So one element that is just starting to hit this is competition. So a few of them have hit, but competition is really starting to occur. We've got multiple CD19 CAR-Ts. So the issue is no longer how do you get it to market and show that it works, it's how do you get it to market, show that it works, and show that you have differentiation versus all the other competitors. So we've got a couple of CD19s, CAR-Ts, more coming. Hemophilia, a few years, we'll have three on the market. So how do you distinguish that? So it's no longer just regulators, payers, it's differentiation too. So again, there's a lot of groups working on DMD, and in 10 years, we've got a huge competition brewing in solid tumor. We've got gamma delta T cells, TILs, TCRs. We've got NKs, we've got NKTs, a lot of different approaches. You're going to have some rare tumors, which will have low competition, but you'll also have, non-small cell, could have quite a number of groups on there. So you need to start thinking about building your differentiation too. So, the systems here historically aren't really set for these types of things. Huge upfront costs, potential cures, disease modifying, and a lot of reimbursement challenges and all that means. So, cost-conscious market, these are expensive. You can have some great value-based pricing, but, there's a difference between when you're doing that in isolation versus when you're doing that with 3 or 4 things that hit the same. So how do you avoid downward pricing pressure? So in a few years, 10 years, there's going to be a large number of these, very expensive things on the market. $2 million a shot, if there's 2 or 3 on the market, hey, great. If there's 100 on the market, how are you going to keep that downward pricing pressure from crushing you? So again, because of the novelty of these, then we have the systems, the regulators, the endpoints, the data gathered, not really designed for these types of therapies. So a lot of development of new endpoints, new surrogate biomarkers, new surrogate endpoints, and a lot of generation of novel registries and other tools and frameworks to capture this information. And of course, when we talk about different regulators and different payers, different countries, different expectations, so you're catering to a huge number. So there's a lot of overlap between what they want, and there's differences. So it's all preparation. So you've got really two major areas to plan this. First, preclinical. This is where you're really doing your initial planning. You're starting with, hopefully you have your TPP, your clinical development plan. You're doing differentiation. You're doing patient selection, because a great way to potentially differentiate yourself is to tightly define your patients, increase your overall response rate. So if you have a 90% or 80% response rate and your competition has a 70%, 60% response rate, there's a great point of differentiation. So if you keep it tight and understand what's happening, there's a great way to predict the patients. There's a great way to differentiate. For example, the CAR Ts on the market. If you are in the box of their phase 3 design, you have a much better outcome than if the patient doesn't neatly fit in the box on the phase 3 design. So if you break away from that and what the pivotal trials were, there's a distinct difference in outcome, which will result in a distinct difference in the payers' attitudes and your ability to maintain that. So, planning everything here at this stage, let me say this. I work with a lot of companies and advise a lot of companies on this. Lack of planning is one of the major downfalls, and one of the major reasons I see companies fail. And it's not clinical trials, it is lack of planning, lack of bringing everything together, integrating early biomarker development, early surrogate development, and when you get to the clinic, because you're hopefully 6-8 years, 2 trials, hopefully 40 to 100 patients, depending on what you're doing, and the rarity of your disease, engaging those payers early, getting their input on that pivotal study design, doing a manufacturing strategy early, and understanding your risk versus reward. So another way to say that is planning for success versus planning not to fail. A lot of small companies, they plan not to fail, they don't plan to succeed. So that means you're looking at the next step or next 2 steps as opposed to this is what our market profile looks like, this is how we're going to get there, these are the patients we're going to capture, and bring it all forward. So for example, accelerated approvals, absolutely wonderful, but a lot of the companies who have RMAT designations, they finish the clinical trials and then they wait a year or more to finish their commercial CMC, so they've just blown a year on their revenue. Now, time is your most important asset, but of course to prepare your commercial CMC, that means you have to take the risk, invest earlier. So there's a distinct risk versus success planning strategy that you need to do and you need to have, and fundraising and a lot of other elements all tie into this. So understand every single aspect early so you can push it through, because you're going to have to make some decisions, and you choose to plan to survive, or you can choose to plan to succeed. And of course, if you're trying to out-license after the phase 1 versus not, then of course that throws on a whole lot of other conditions. So some examples let me talk about, one other thing, your phase 1-2 study, you're going to have these patients around 6-8 years up to your pivotal study patients, you only have them around for 2 to 3 years of data. So you need to extract everything you possibly can in a long-term follow-up study. It's not a safety study, it's an efficacy and durability study, which happens to have safety. So those are your patients who are the really only patients who are going to understand your actual value of your product. So hopefully in some cases, it's are they still alive? But in a lot of other cases, you're trying to get a lot deeper, and some of those are shown here. So understanding, this is a few different areas of gaps I commonly see, or some of them are a little more aspirational in terms of elements that should be included in your clinical trials. So are you profiling your donors or the recipients when they're taking the cells? If they're spiking IL-10 or TNF or interferon or something like that, should you wait a week before pulling the cells or delivering the cells? I mean, are those associated with a lack of response, lack of engraftment, and downstream outcome? So there's a lot of manufacturing data, particularly for the autologous ones, which you could roll in and use to predict patient success. And of course, we concentrate on the early and the top line, the obvious efficacy evaluations. But you need to go deeper. As a rule of thumb, I sort of like to say, and this is sort of a wild guess, if you really understand the true impact versus the traditional impact of your value, well, maybe the value of your therapy doubles or more. So, for example, if you understand a lot of these diseases are tied with direct comorbidities, but if you're not tracking the impact on that comorbidity, you've lost a lot of value. So if that comorbidity is driving hospital visits, are you missing hundreds of thousands of dollars per year of medical costs that you no longer, that the system no longer has to pay for? So obviously you want to understand durability in your long-term follow-up, but quality of life and impact of quality of life. And hopefully we're going to be able to really understand the value of quality of life over the long term and start integrating that. But, PROs, the ability of the patient to work, much, creative ways to get much deeper to understand what your therapy is really doing, not I'm in hemophilia, so therefore I'm reducing the crisis and the hospital visits from 8 to 10 a year to 0 to 1 a year, but there's a lot deeper if you start tracking those. And we have some abilities, registries, data sets, and things like that, and we'll talk about that a little. So with that, I'd like to introduce Adrian McKemey, who will guide the rest of the panel and introduce the speakers.
Apparently that way safer. I'm taking the tricky route up here.
So there's no microphone here. Let's see if there's...
So good morning. Okay, there's some caffeine in the room, not much, but some caffeine. I've got mine here. So good morning. All right. My name's Adrian McKemey. I'm from an institution called IQVIA. I still feel like I have to explain what that is because it's a lousy brand name. It's the love child of Quintiles and IMS. They got together because Quintiles, you could argue, had a lot of the data about therapies pre-registration, and IMS had a lot of the information about therapies post-registration, and presumably there was some more money to be made by putting the two together and forming more of a data science company than a pure services company. So within IQVIA, I run the R&D consulting group, and I'm also accountable for a CERM-funded initiative that we have called the Cell and Gene Therapy Group. And through those two enterprises over the last few years, we've really got to see a lot of what's happening around a lot of the companies that were in this room 3-4 years ago and are in this room today. And one interesting observation is the things that we were talking about as speculative opportunities and challenges then are now, the field is moving so quickly, they're now clear and present opportunities and challenges. And so what we tried to do was to take the topic of evidence, because it's all about evidence, and use an array of esteemed colleagues that are actually in the trenches facing these problems right now, not in a speculative planning kind of way, but in an operational day-to-day function, and ask them questions like, what are the current challenges, what are the gaps, what do we need going forward to properly solve for some of these problems? evidence was once described to me as data with an attitude. And we certainly have a lot of attitude on the panel today, and it covers the complete value chain, as George was saying. So, for instance, Stuart is bringing to us today, particularly, a preclinical lens. Eamon, a particularly clinical lens. Manny, a particular market access lens. Chris, the whole potential for real-world data. And some of the systems and provisions that we already have that maybe we're not all aware of how to properly use and get the most value from, as much of clinical evidence is beginning to rely more on real-world evidence. And of course, John Doyle, who is architecting the future of the commercial system into which these products get paid for in his new job at Pfizer. And then George, who was introduced earlier. George, where are you? Where are you? Oh, okay, and George. In case, and I'm sorry about these black shrouded chairs. It feels like we're all attending a funeral. This is I'd asked for pink, but that just didn't. So I think that if it were as simple as each of these executives giving narrow answers on their particular functional topics, we'd have lost the point on the panel. The idea is, because of the accelerated timelines, and because of the nature of the integration that we have to provide in cell and gene therapies, two things are happening. There's a requirement, a much stronger requirement for integration of all of this information, and also simultaneity. Things that used to be years in previous therapy development value chains are turning into months. And you could integrate sequentially, piece by piece, but the integration of the information that we're going to need to support these therapies needs to be much more real time. So we want to touch on that too. And we'll find that we have some of the provisions within our current system to solve for that, and some that we have to go out and leverage other entities, such as the patient foundations and be the matches of this world. So we want to explore that a little bit too. Please do ask questions. We have plenty of time. The worst kinds of panels, from my perspective, is where there's like a United Nations set piece from each participant. But I mean, if this is any good at all, there should be questions coming from you guys. Something provocative that somebody said, Eamon, and something that requires might require a question or a challenge. But to start off, let me ask each of the candidates. No particular order. Institution, role, those are the standard stuff, but then to expound a little bit and to take some time to expound on, in their role, in the current stage of development that they're in, what are some of the greatest challenges that they're facing at the moment? And we'll get to solutions later, but just the challenges. So, I don't know, maybe Stuart, start with you.
Surely. I'm hoping that people at the back can hear me and the mic's on. Raise your hand if you can. Okay, so Stuart Abbott, I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Scientific Officer for a small biotech in Menlo Park in California called Adicet Bio. We're technically a CAR T-cell company, but we work on a particular flavor of T-cells called gamma delta T-cells, a small subpopulation that we believe will be more effective in controlling tumor growth and for other indications as well. And beyond that, we also have an approach to targeting different antigens on cells, which include targeting intracellular antigens using antibodies that behave quite a lot like T-cell receptors. Adicet's been in existence for 4 years now, set up late 2014, initially funded in 2015. And as Adrian mentioned, we are a preclinical stage company with aspirations of becoming a clinical stage company early next year. So we're at the moment planning for IND applications and first patient, first dose. And I'd love to sit here and tell you that our target product profiles for all of our product candidates have lofty commercialization goals. That's the end that we have in mind. The reality is a little more pragmatic. The reality is that most of our target product profiles are focused on what we need to achieve to demonstrate safety and efficacy in our phase 1, phase 2 studies, with a nod to thinking about what we need to do as we move further through the development process. I can tell you a couple of exceptions, just briefly, that we might talk about later, where we have got a more long-term view of what we're doing, as we go into the clinic. One is in manufacturing. So in this space, you'll probably be aware that not all parts of your manufacturing process have to be cGMP compliant prior to entering into first-in-human dosing. However, one assumes that you have to have full GMP compliance as we move through the development. As a small company, we've chosen to have full GMP compliance for our manufacturing process ahead of phase 1 study. And that was specifically to avoid problems further down the line in relation to swapping from a non-cGMP compliant process to a GMP compliant process. The other exception that we've made is thinking about the future, and I think actually George highlighted this earlier in terms of the competition that might exist. Right now, in our small world of CAR T cells, we're dealing with 2 approved products, Kymriah and Yescarta. Terrific products, fantastic for the field to be able to move those through development into commercialization, but that's now. We are entering clinical studies next year. We're likely to be in commercial company several years after that. And so as we look at the fit of our candidates, we're not looking at the fit of the candidates in the current scenario of what's in the competitive landscape, but what's likely to be there in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. And what we assume is that there's a lot more competition coming. We're planning for the success of the field, and in the success of the field, we're looking to be successful within that and to create value differentiation for patients, for payers, as we go forward. But we do expect there to be a lot more competition coming through. And so with that very brief introduction, I'll probably stop and pass over to colleagues.
But just to be clear, you've said something really insightful that
I did.
many things.
Awfully early in the morning for that.
But in principle, and in practice is always a little bit different, you're thinking about competitive differentiation at the preclinical level.
We are.
That's a big statement. I mean, it's just going to be necessary, but I don't know that, 3 years ago we weren't hearing that. Now we're beginning to hear that it's just necessary because of the crowded nature of the field coming up. But it'll be interesting to see how well, any other preclinical stages in the audience that are already thinking about commercial differentiation? Okay, so, a rough guess, that was about 20% of all the preclinical before, so the panel for a small fee are available for consultation afterwards. And thank you, Stuart. So let's just go through Manny. Manny, what's your role, affiliation, and what keeps you up at night?
So head of market access and pricing at Atara Biotherapeutics. Atara Biotherapeutics is a 7-year-old allogeneic cell therapy company. We expect to be commercially ready in a couple of years here. My role is essentially the fixer. And it's the fixer for the problem that we're here to talk about today, which is to say certain things we can fix, certain things we can't fix. But regardless, it is my job and my team's job to communicate value out of whatever mess we get at the end of a clinical study. And I say that with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, because sometimes it is a mess. Sometimes the population is wrong. Sometimes the endpoints are wrong. Sometimes the magnitude of benefit just isn't there relative to standard of care. And oftentimes we are forced to make do with what we have instead of be a part of the dialogue early enough to impact value in the most fundamental ways. And so fixer, hope to not be a fixer at some point in my career. I hope to be a partner at the earliest stages of development moving forward. And I know one of the questions that you had, George, or Adrian, as you thought about this topic is, sort of what keeps us up at night. And, at the end of the day, there are 3 areas that I'm concerned about fundamentally. The first being for our industry. Our reputation has never been worse. And that's something that we need to all take ownership of and fight tooth and nail, because we will not exist in a paradigm that suggests that payers rule the world. I have job security. Our company, unprecedented complexity, Mars mission complexity, and we're doing it every single day. How do we translate that so that the public understands, so that the policymakers understand, so that the payers get it, that when we come to them at the end of a 20-year journey, maybe it was a 40-year journey, maybe it started in the 40s. But how do we communicate the value of all of that went before to get us to today? Half of all companies that get an FDA approval do so only once. It's a lot of burden on the successes, and there's a lot of companies that never make it. I've been at a few. And then as a market access leader within my organizations, how do I prove what I believe? I believe we have a cure. I'm not even allowed to say it most of the time. If I can't say it, how do I prove it? How do I convince other people that what I have is durable and long-term? And that involves everyone on this stage, in this room, working together to prove that the markers that we see in early development translate into durable benefit beyond the studies that we have. And so, there you go.
Whoosh, there's a little bit to dig into there. The Fixer sounds like a network TV show. But would you say, I've just got 3 or 4 questions, and the audience, please, dig in and ask more. But would you say you were fixing things that were intrinsic to the program that could not have been known, mostly? Or would you say you were fixing a plan that could have been identified, mostly? Or is it half and half?
It's half and half. And I got to say, the state of data availability is often lacking. And I'm very glad to see that this panel is sponsored by IQVIA, however you say it, and then, of course, CIBMTR. It really will take a concerted effort between all of these organizations to provide the foundational information that we need to make the right decisions. Right now, I can say the state of the union is not great with respect to our data resources, but I think if we work together across platforms, open up data, share that data, mine that data appropriately, we'll get to a better place. But right now, I can't say with confidence that I can do any real-world data study in under a year or 8 months and get me the answers I need to inform trials in the real-time way we deserve.
Yeah,
I don't think we're there.
That's a very powerful statement on data, which I think most applicants will have ideas about different ways to access and harness and use data. Just 2 more questions. I was intrigued, because we hadn't discussed it before, about your question or your observation about the reputation of the industry being at an all-time low. Was that general biopharma, or was that cell and gene specific?
And I struggle with that one as well. I would say this. Pricing is an industry concern. But we do need to differentiate between the eras of pharmaceutical innovation that have transpired over the past sort of 20 years. We started in an era of, you could charge $1 per pill per day for a therapy that would target tens of millions of Americans. We moved to an era of what we would call personalized medicine with oncology, with the HER2 targeted agents, the VEGFs, et cetera, that targeted hundreds of thousands of patients. And, then of course prices had to go up to bridge us through that transition. My company's targeting a population of fewer than 1,000 in the US. We have to have these very real conversations around how much can we invest and what is life worth. We happen to believe that life is immeasurable and that cures are worth pursuing at all costs, but the market doesn't feel that way. And so we have a reputational problem to overcome. Because of our sins of the past, we have sinned. But hopefully there's redemption in the cures that we have come up with.
The final thing before moving on to Eamon is, and we had this discussion before, and it's to return to later, but there is an extraordinarily high burden of proof for cure. And without getting too religious, various messiah analogies came up on our previous calls, and if you cured a handful of people, it was a cure. But I think that the bar for establishing cure now, a couple of thousand years later, is necessarily and reasonably different. But I think that the discussion at the policy level for what constitutes cure is probably something that's a little bit fluid.
Absolutely.
Eamon.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Eamon Shalaby, and I am here to kind of represent the clinical early, mid, late stage development of cell and gene therapies. I'm currently at GSK GlaxoSmithKline. A lot of you probably don't associate GSK with cell and gene therapies, but one of the things that attracted me to join the organization was they actually have the first gene therapy approved, Strimvelis, back in 2016. And over the years of about a decade, have built some really robust infrastructure, particularly around manufacturing, supply chain, process development. The new head of R&D, Hal Barron, came on board, who was former kind of leader of Juno, and said, let's divest the rare disease portfolio and focus this platform on oncology. Hence, my role to bring these things into the clinic and get them approved. So personally, I think this is probably the most exciting time ever in oncology drug development. Yeah, there's plenty of challenges, and we can talk to all the challenges, but just reflecting back on the beginning of my career, when I was doing training, there was a young lady who made a statement that back then I thought was very absurd, and she said, "You have the cure for cancer, but we just can't get it," right? So if you think about that statement back then, had different connotations, and if you fast forward 21 years later, and having been fortunate to be part of 5 programs that got approved in oncology, this one is potentially the biggest one that we're working on, and being able to reflect on that statement, there is some underlying challenges, and I don't want to say truth to it, it's not truth at all, but we're facing challenges here where we may be developing curative therapies that may not be accessible to patients, at least in the near term. This is a massive problem. So how are we approaching this? I think two things. So let me just tell you what I'm not. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert clinician. I'm not a manufacturing expert. But what I have been really, really focused on doing is playing more of an integrator role. Integrator across the different functional expertise. There's 17 groups it takes to represent a product development program, whether it's regulatory, supply chain, market access, IP, et cetera, et cetera. One of my biggest focus is integration of that internal expertise, but to change the mindset, historically drug development paradigms have been one product, one question, one clinical trial, one answer, one value evidence package, one approval, and then you design the development paradigm to get you the fastest market approval, regardless of the business case. You just want to get that out there as quickly as you can. And then you drive value through life cycle management of that same product in other tumor types, earlier stages of disease, et cetera, et cetera. So your value driving indication is not your first approval, in oncology at least. It's, for the past decade, we've said speed to market and parallel life cycle management to drive value. The challenge is, by the time you get to the market with these cell and gene therapies, there's 2 or 3 or 4 other innovations that have already developed that you don't have time to drive that individual product more broadly, right? So you have to switch thinking, in my view, is you have to look to more platform development. You're developing platforms. You're investing early in things like scalable supply chain that's adaptable. You're investing in master protocols where you can take generation 1 of an agent and then efficacy enhanced engineering, same target, same platform, but a little bit modified into the same protocol, and potentially wrap
a platform that can take in multiple next generation constructs, right? So I would urge us to start thinking to move from one product, one question, one approval lifecycle management to how do we develop these platforms that can potentially have a series of iterative lifecycle development programs. Because the business cases for these things are upside down, right? If you are a small company looking to capital infrastructure investment, the timelines, et cetera, it's hard to make a business case to get investors to invest in your platform, in your program. So, with a company like GSK that can put in a lot of upfront bolus resources, maybe we can change some of that thinking. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, shifting to the role of an integrator. We can't do this as companies alone. We're trying to build our own long-term follow-up trial. We're trying to develop our own apheresis programs and, patient identification. Oh my God, companion diagnostics is really going to come into play. You can't just assume you're going to treat an unselected patient population. So when you pile on companion diagnostics, sometimes HLA-restricted target expression, you pile on autologous supply chain and apheresis and all of that stuff, why are we building this on our own? There is a real need for these pre-competitive, nonprofit, patient-oriented groups to really partner together. And let's make it easy for the end user, the patient and the physicians, and let's not each company try to develop their own end-to-end processes. And that's part of the value chain and value proposition as well. So I'll stop there.
That's a perfect segue to Chris and Be the Match, because how many people know about the indecipherable TLA, or it's not a three-letter acronym, it's a multi-letter MLA, CIMBTR?
This is a common reaction.
We've got to work on your marketing, man, right? So anyway, this is to Eamon's questions, that there's the system effects, and they're going to need us to go outside our companies and do some pre-competitive alliances under the right conditions. But it's not like we have to invent everything from scratch, because there are some federally funded programs which, I can't use certain words, but they have a preeminent position in the data around cell therapies that we haven't begun to properly attach. And one of the things that Chris will be too shy to ask you for directly, but you guys have got business needs, and his data source, if we tune it up and put a bit of investment into it, he can answer lots of them. But you can have the reveal now. BTM, CIMBTR.
Yeah, so thank you for that, and thank you for asking me to join the panel this morning. I've had the pleasure of engaging with Stuart, Manny, and Eamon's companies, and also IQVIA for the last couple of years. I represent an organization called Be the Match. Scientists often know Be the Match as the National Marrow Donor Program. It's a much more descriptive name. We sit right in the center of the ecosystem that supplies cell therapies into the bone marrow and HSC transplant community. And we look at bone marrow transplant as still the most widely used life-saving cellular therapy in the world. And it is a very complex ecosystem that we operate in. We believe this ecosystem is very much applicable to the ecosystems that you are all developing. Because of the kind of the catbird seat that I have working with a lot of these institutions, I get to see a lot of the sausage making across the board. And I know that there are real pressures, of course, in drug development. I come from drug development, okay, so I've joined the organization only recently. I know the pressures, especially of early stage drug development. And these are real. The clinical teams, it's hard to get a drug just to the point where it could possibly be approved, right? You start layering on other pre-competitive aspects, payer aspects into the equation, becomes even more complicated. Stuart, I know the benefit of some insight into what Stuart's company is doing tremendously sophisticated cell editing, right? So what are the clinical ramifications of those edits? Well, yes, that in itself is a massive question. But where we are at Be the Match National Marrow Donor Program, we have a research arm. It is called the CIBMTR. It's actually quite a large research arm. It's 200 people, jointly funded by the National Marrow Donor Program and the Medical College of Wisconsin. And we have for many years now in anonymity been collecting data on transplant outcomes. We now have transplant outcome data, longitudinal data on over 500,000 transplants. We are federally mandated as the repository for this information. And to the extent that new cell therapies are being experimented with in the setting of the transplant center, you may not all know this, but that data is coming to us as well. We are the recipient of all the efficacy data from clinical studies and also some of the early commercial launch products for drugs that are administered in the setting of the transplant center, which is a lot, right? And we know from the most recent ARM report, 2/3 of the cell therapies being developed today are in blood and marrow cancers. Those are likely to be administered in the setting of the transplant center. All of that data is coming to us. We are gathering it. We are assembling data sets out of it. The point being to inform clinical decision making. So it's a loop. Now this effort that we all are going to embark on, and I will emphasize the word "all" here. This is going to take a unified, concerted, muscular effort to get this data into shape for us all to make the best, for clinicians to make the best clinical decisions. This is one of those things, we all live in this PowerPoint world, right, where sometimes very sophisticated process flows are put on PowerPoint slides. They look very, very simple. Put a process flow together for aggregating all this data and sharing it and have a continuous ecosystem loop of the feedback into the data. It's impossible to even make a simple PowerPoint slide. It is so complicated, especially in the fractured healthcare system we have in the United States. So we are working with IQVIA on this right now. We are working with a number of partners, industry partners as well, to try to make this happen. The big challenge here is not, do we have the intellect or capability to gather the data? Of course we do. We can do that. But how do we do it quickly? And how do we make the data usable quickly? How do we make the data usable real time? These are big challenges. We are investing many millions of dollars at Be The Match, CIBMTR, on this problem right now. We can't do it alone, so we'll look forward to partnerships with panelists here, IQVIA, and of course, folks in the audience as we go forward.
And it's an initiative that's in the visioning stage still, and so on your behalf, I'm sure I could offer solicitation of opinion about more detail about what it is and what can be done, because it's democratic around all of your many of your therapies, and for instance, you are by default the Chimera Outcomes Long-Term Follow-Up Registry.
Not so much in a way default, in that we were receiving the information about both Yescarta and Kymriah, but we have now contracted with both Kite Gilead and Novartis to officially be the outcomes registry for those two products, utilizing the infrastructure we have in place. This is an important factor. Again, most people in the audience won't know us. We won't know the infrastructure we have, but we do have contractual relationships with 180 transplant centers, and they are mandated to send us their data. So we are effectively getting the data. However, we want to make the data as useful as possible. We want to make sure the sponsors feel that they have control over the data. This is a big issue for the sponsors. They do not really love the fact that we're getting this data and we might disseminate it. So now we want to partner with the organizations that are developing the drugs to make sure that the data is embargoed. It is embargoed, so there is a period of time where the companies they're the only ones that have access to the data, but then we want to make the data available to the clinical community, to the payer community, for the obvious reasons of better clinical decision making. And I think there's been a lot of wisdom just in the introductions that's been shared here. This field is already very competitive. It is going to get more crowded. I think we all believe that, or we wouldn't be here. There's going to be, pharma will do life cycle management, as Eamon said, to some of these products. We do need to be in a position, we want to avoid what I consider to be the nightmare pharma scenario, which is there's great data. The drug works. It's safe. It's relatively safe. The safety concerns can be managed. But the drug never gets to the patient because of some externality, whether it be the supply chain, whether it be reimbursement, whether it just be the sheer volume of training that's required at these institutions at point of care to implement a new therapy, right? We are very close with the transplant community. This is our primary stakeholder, transplant physicians and their staff. We are hearing very clearly from those physicians and their staff. They don't really care if there's going to be 5 CD19 CAR Ts. They're not going to implement all 5 because implementing one requires them to train 500 people in the hospital. They also have to take on the financial burden of actually paying for the therapy in advance. Oh, and by the way, they're responsible for the ultimate complexity, which is taking care of the sick patient, right? They also have to take care of the side effects. Now they're also being made responsible for supplying the outcomes data. Way too much burden on the point of care in this scenario. And they will let you know that. They just cannot handle this level of complexity for every one of these products. So it's up to us as a group to figure out how do we supply enough data, how do we supply access to the therapies in a fashion that's efficient for the clinical decision makers. And it's, again, this is a massive challenge, not beyond us to do it, but it will require a broad participation in the solutioning.
I'm not sure whether Eric was waving or drowning, but he did seem to have a question.
Yeah, so to Aiden's point about the mind shift that comes along with going towards technological platforms, and then also what Chris is suggesting, which is a different kind of shift as well, which is shifting more towards an evidence platform. And the convergence of those two is certainly not easy, because we're at the point where the rules of the road for clinical development are changing, in part driven by this space. About half of the things at launch are single-arm studies. We have the rise of real-world evidence, both in Europe and in North America, and things like the 21st Century Cures Act. So the evidence platform issue is also evolving. It makes us think outside of the box in terms of traditional development functions around evidence, and how do those two things go together? Sorry. Yeah.
And Eric, do you have any particular ideas about how to reframe the evidence platform?
Well, I think you have to measure 3 or 4 times and cut once. I think you need to be aware of how the world is evolving and expectations. What good looks like is changing right now, and you have to be thinking about it early. You just have to plan for it.
Yeah.
You have to understand market precedent, what works, what doesn't work, how crowded the space is, a number of factors, and then you have to align it with the technological platform and how it's evolving as well, which is also changing rapidly. There's a lot of platform evolution in this space alone, and pulling those two things together is I think, part of where the sizzle is in the future.
And let me press you on one more thing before we move to John, but would it be appropriate for you to give a little bit of a highlight of the work you're doing with the ARM Foundation?
So from more of it's weird talking into a cube, but so
It looks a bit strange too, actually.
it does. So for ARM Foundation, we're doing an effort called the Value of Cell and Gene Therapy, and part of what we're doing is developing a multi-disease model that is agnostic to disease, that allows us to look at value and impact of this industry to make arguments about why is this space different. Why is it important? Why is it so important to work with other stakeholders outside of the industry to break down some of the barriers? And there are significant ones. If you look at actual coverage of all the products that have launched so far, their uptake curves look very different. It's why should we change the system, and why do we need to think differently, which underlies different platforms of both evidence and technology. We've got to think differently.
And also for potentially curative therapies, finding those buckets of cost avoidance which don't naturally lie in the gift of the existing elements of payment.
And there will be parts of system impact that we'll consider, and this is an effort involving multiple companies and different groups. We will consider things that no stakeholder is currently considering, but it reflects the impact of where this industry, what it will have on systems.
Yeah. And just by the way, there are a couple of different initiatives from ARM itself, which is policy and advocacy, and the ARM Foundation, which separates itself necessarily legally from being less business interested, but more about educating the patients. And to one of your earlier questions about reputation of the industry, we're certainly looking for as much input as we can to give the public the appropriate perception of not only the Mars mission kind of technology that goes into these, but the extraordinary, almost binary impact on disease.
And just to add to that, right? So payers are organized, right? They are publishing, they're influencing the dialogue. How many of you have heard about the idea that 30 million Americans have a rare disease? I know I have, right? That's a message that is planted by the payers to scare everyone into thinking that these lives that we are trying to save are not worth it. Take that 30 million American number. 7,000 rare diseases. That implies 4,000 patients per rare disease, which is not a whole lot of patients onto whom you can burden drug development, number one. How many of those 7,000 rare diseases will be cured in our lifetimes? The specter and the boogeyman of budget impact is often a myth planted in the media by payers to scare the public, to scare policymakers. And we need to fight back by saying, hey, the budget impact for all of these rare diseases that we are curing, pennies in the bucket. And we need to be as clear as they are being clear to fight the message. We can't let them dominate, and they are.
And then to John, the introductions. John used to be in the trenches with me in IQVIA for a long time, but then evolved to a more sophisticated position. And now he's in a role that, everything we've heard could go 10 degrees sideways because of, his discussions with the president. And anyway, John, I'm joking a little bit, but if you explain your role on anticipating new commercial strategies for actually covering the initial cost of these somewhat still speculative therapies.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so I lead the Innovation Center at Pfizer, and we're predominantly focused on go-to-market innovation. And there's 4 domains that we oversee, and they touch on really all the themes that we just heard about. The first domain is access, so really focusing on willingness to pay and optimizing access to innovative medicine. And with a focus on cell and gene therapy, there's work to be done, which we've heard so far about some of those challenges. I could expound on some of the things that we're doing. Second is affordability. So if you think of access as willingness to pay, affordability is ability to pay. So even when you're able to demonstrate the value of your medicine, your gene therapy as being cost-effective, life-saving, you might find that it's just not deemed affordable. And obviously there's interplay between affordability and access, but we're finding that's a distinct challenge to be solved for in the marketplace at multiple levels, at the government level, at the commercial carrier level, at the PBM level, at the IDN level, at the provider level, and at the patient level. Each one of those levels requires very specific thinking about how to assist in affordability, and that has to be done through partnership. There's all sorts of exciting things on that front, ranging from drug mortgages, authored by a good friend at MIT that's talking about direct payment loans to payers as well as to patients.
Is that Andrew Lowe?
Yep,
Yeah.
Andrew Lowe, and there's a number of other affordability type solutions that really have emerged from the smaller markets, emerging markets where there's a lot of out-of-pocket spending, where we're trying to import some of those concepts back into the United States. So access and affordability are very big. You hear a little bit about the innovative financing models, like the Netflix model everyone was talking about for a while with the Hep C products down in Louisiana. So a number of states are filing for waivers to essentially allow for value-based payment over time so that you could amortize an investment in a cure, essentially. So taking a one-time payment that could be $500, $1 million, $2 million, as we now know, and essentially spreading that over time. That can't be done without some policy changes. There's all sorts of challenges with portability of insurance at the commercial level, and then if a pharma company was to engage with a payer in that way, you have to solve for policy challenges like anti-kickback statutes and best price. So there's a policy component and a market-based component to solving for access and affordability. And all this starts, T-minus 2 to 3 years prior to launch, at least. Because you find that with benefit design, even when you're discussing these ideas with payers that want to create or co-create an innovative solution, they need at least 1 to 2 years to get in front of their benefit design cycling. So the way they contract, so if you're talking to them today, you might be talking about 2021 2022 contracting. And that's a challenge. And so you have to be in front of that. And when you're negotiating with them about that, you have to be informed. So all the points were made about mining for data early, trying to get those insights, building your models, potentially using artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then sharing that with the different payers. So access, affordability, the value chain is the third domain. So really thinking through where do we fit in as a manufacturer of cell and gene therapy in the healthcare value chain. So delivery and financing, distribution, all the different facets that go into from taking the product from a manufacturing standpoint all the way to the bedside for the patient. And I think for many years the industry sort of observed that value chain and just figured we fit in maybe this spot here or that spot there. And really it's about trying to solve for a better value chain and partnering again to try to potentially disrupt that value chain with new players. There's new technology companies that are entering, new data companies, and it's important to be thinking about how to potentially disrupt the value chain, especially in gene therapy. And the last, but certainly not least, is patient experience. So what do we do to maximize and optimize the patient experience all the way from pre-diagnosis, through treatment, adherence, outcome, total cost of care, follow-up, and ensuring that we're thinking about how to optimize that full experience and measure it in a way that's going to resonate, first of all, with the patient. So looking at things that matter to them, not just with respect to our products, but also with respect to every other value inflection point according to that value chain. So it's really taking a very holistic view, and then again, being thoughtful about who are the companies out there that are engaging with patients in new and novel ways and coming up with patient services using the Internet of Things and sensors and wearables so that you could just gain better insights, not just to improve your own drug development, which is terrific, but then to share it with the rest of the value chain and say, we think we could tinker at the diagnostic phase. For instance, we might be able to use machine learning to find the rare disease patient that we're searching for. And it's in your best interest to do that because the patient won't cycle through the system inefficiently. So that's just a couple of examples of what we're doing in those 4 different domains of innovation.
So as I recall, obviously things will change, because it's Pfizer, you'll buy somebody at some point. But the gene therapies that you have at the moment are in hemophilia and muscular dystrophies?
Those are a couple in later stage pipe, yes.
Right. And so how much of this almost policy of upfront money and underwriting would you, maybe you can't answer this for the whole company, but would you personally ascribe to being proprietary to Pfizer deals, or how much can benefit the whole industry, or should benefit the whole industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't know the exact proportion, but I could tell you that a lot of the activity is really with the industry in mind. So partnering is going to be key. So a couple of points were made by my fellow panelists that we have to kind of go at this together. Eric made the point about the value framework. We're intimately involved in that program of effort with the ARM Foundation and with other players. We need a better value framework to evaluate our innovative products, and that we can't solve together. ICER has their point of view, other HTAs have their points of view. Payers are going to, by convenience, lock in on the point of view that provides them their best argument to tamp down the valuation. And so we need alternatives, and that takes time and effort on the policy front, as well as with more of an entrepreneurial flair, if you will, and working with other companies to go out there and solve for it, publish it, and I think be very specific about why it's different from a generic value framework that doesn't work as well for cell and gene therapy because of its very unique nature, the curative nature and the long-term follow-up and all the other facets that we've talked about. So that's one. And the other one would be, what we've learned on the policy front is when you want to solve for affordability, which I had talked to a little bit before, it's really important to approach Washington, CMS, or the Office of Inspector General together with other companies, and not just industry companies. It's best to do it with companies that normally would sit on the other side of the negotiation table, like with payers. So you all may have heard of Cigna's Embark. Embark is their solution for gene therapy distribution and financing. And they're essentially marketing that to the industry as the answer. In order to engage in that type of program and similar programs with this capitation or Netflix model and amortizing payment over time, you need to have some policy allowance for that. You need waivers, and it's always best to do that in concert with other companies. So we're talking to big insurance carriers, big PBMs, of approaching DC together to ask for some of these waivers to allow for some innovative affordability solutions for gene therapy.
Thank you. So that was sort of the panel introductions, and let me pause there for a second. Do any of those topics raise other questions that we want to dig into with the individual panelists now?
So I have a point on a lot of this. One thing I hear from a lot of small companies is we're not going to commercialize, we're going to get bought out, we're going to out-license. So when I'm advising companies on purchasing, in-licensing, and things like that, I'm looking at, during the phase 1-2, are they engaging with payers to design their pivotal study? Are they preparing for commercialization? Every year, because we're looking at time to revenue as well as revenue, every year that time to revenue delays, we're knocking 25 to 40% off the value of the asset. So if you aren't working with payers right out during your phase 1 to design your pivotal trial or planning for the time to commercialization, I may probably end up knocking half the value of you think what your asset's worth simply because you're not doing this planning, engaging in all these things early.
There was another question over here.
Just at a very high level.
I'm not sure that box is working. Is it working?
Can you hear me? Does that work?
Okay.
At a very high level, I'm just kind of curious in the thoughts in the panel. It feels like the FDA has made huge strides in helping gene and cell therapy companies prepare their data and know exactly what they need to do to get through IND into phase 1. But perhaps the payers are still dragging their heels on helping companies prepare for market access and what they need to do. But maybe that's just the natural evolution of where we are, with the wave of INDs that have been filed. The FDA was kind of forced to do that, and maybe the wave of approved products will force the payers to move a little faster. But I'm just kind of curious if you think the payers need to kind of up their game to a certain extent.
And before the panel evaluate this, I want to say two things that we discussed collectively to fold into the mix. One thing was the FDA seemed to go hot and then cold on external comparator arms, which obviously a good part of speed. But then when you come to the payer hurdle, well, what's your efficacy against standard of care? And that becomes another whole exploration. And then, well, let's leave it there. I mean, there does seem to be a hot and cold blowing on the, what's been your experience with external comparator arms?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, at least my perspective. I mean, what we do know, and one thing I'd like to challenge you on, George, a little bit, is 6 to 8 year development cycle for a very, very innovative technology, I think, is probably on the long side. I think in my head, I think of a 3-year development cycle, getting approved on phase 1B data with transformational efficacy and a tolerable benefit profile. But certainly the other indications coming in that 6 to 8 year horizon. But what that means is obviously we're not going to have head-to-head comparison data, and the control arm is not only linked to a regulatory decision, but also that head-to-head data is not going to be available for payer and market access, right? So I think it even gets more complicated when you have to have biomarker matched patients in the real-world control arm, and there's a regulatory view that has persisted over time that says we need the exact same patients that you enrolled in the trial as your real-world control arm. The reality is, in a rare disease, a rare patient population, you're not going to be able to get the exact same patients that have not only clinically annotated, but also biomarker matched patients. So the evidence package to support what the standard of care is going to be is going to have a lot of gaps in it, not just from a regulatory perspective, but also from a payer perspective, right? So the U.S., I think, is, to your point, have been incredibly engaged in helping us solve this. It may be hot or cold, but the challenge is this spans across multiple groups of the agency. And if you go to Europe, they're still, I would say, several years behind in accepting some of these issues. So the data package to support regulatory risk benefit and the data package to support payer access going to have tons of gaps in it. And this is where I really believe the external platform integrators, you know, in the field that I'm working in right now is synovial sarcoma, right? Not even 1,000. There's actually 214 patients, you know, in the U.S. and Europe that we're targeting based on this specific tumor. And that evidence package is going to be very small, right? So.
You know, one of the things that I would add is that, you know, the FDA certainly has been forward-thinking with respect to one of the most important things that we do is delivering a clear magnitude of benefit, right? You know, you take, in our specific case, patients that would live a median of 2 months, and at the end of a year, 60% of patients are alive. That's a hazard ratio, if you wanted to do the calculation, of 0.05. And so the FDA very rightly says, I'm going to, you know, be less concerned about these therapies. But then take the other end of the spectrum. The payer has a different incentive. And we can wax philosophically around incentives, but folks talk a lot about budgets as if they are fixed in time. What we're really talking about with commercial insurers is profit. And for the social welfare states and the social programs, what we're really talking about is budgetary overruns that eat into other social welfare programs. That's what we're really talking about. And so there are differences in opinions with respect to how the social good is allocated across different stakeholders, right? And so what we need to do is have an open and robust dialogue of what we really, truly value. And if we can get to that point, I think payers will start to move more quickly. And it will really take a concerted and focused effort, right? Because each of the little companies creating all of these tiny therapies, shouting collectively, may not be as big as, you know, their bottom line.
Maybe I did
Yeah.
a comment just from a very early perspective. The FDA have made huge strides in supporting our industry, certainly in the transition from preclinical into clinical stage. A lot of guidance has come out, very pragmatic, a lot of access to the FDA. But I'll touch on a point that was made earlier about platform technologies and where the industry might be going. I'd argue that the only group in the world that's sitting on perhaps more information than Be the Match in terms of clinical outcome related to product characteristics is the FDA. If we're, or other regulatory agencies, including EMA, but FDA as an example. If we're going to move to a platform technology or approach, which I think was alluded to earlier, we have to be able to stop treating every platform improvement is a brand new product. If many of you have driven here today in brand new cars, all of those cars, you know, brand new, probably only had 2 to 5% difference from the last model. However, in our paradigm for testing and introducing drugs effectively assumes that we have to test the whole 100% of the vehicle for safety and efficacy every time. And that's challenging, it's problematic, it's costly, it adds to the cost of the therapy, overall it adds to the timeline, etc. So at some point we hopefully will be able to use this huge amount of data to start thinking about these therapies as platforms and testing the safety and efficacy of the incremental improvement as opposed to the overall drug product. And that's a paradigm shift as we go forward. But I think it's enabled by data, and it's enabled by the people who have the most data.
I'm just going to comment on the second part of the question regarding the payer engagement. And I acknowledge Manny's point that I think the rhetoric out there is generally very negative, and the payers know what they're doing in terms of creating sound bites about the burden, the economic burden that they would have to pay. But I do find when you engage early enough is that they understand the pressure they're under to cover these products. And they are looking for creative solutions to assist in how to make it affordable. So how to spread the payment over time, which I'd mentioned before, how to capitate the payment according to some kind of epidemiology level, how to find a way to share the risk in some type of performance-based agreement. And that is all data-driven. So just the same type of data that Stuart's talking to that would be informative with regard to effectiveness, comparative effectiveness, risk-benefit, would also be informative on the payer front. And so I think it's important not to wait for that, that guidance document, so to speak, from payers. It's probably not forthcoming because they're all competing with each other too. And they're also afraid of something that they call sort of selective determination or selective risk, meaning if they come up with a great program for gene therapy, they're afraid that they'll attract patients from different rare diseases all into their plan. And so they want to be fairly confidential when they're talking with you about how to create a program that meets your needs and their needs. So they consider that proprietary in terms of how they're engaging. So they're not going to be publicizing those types of programs so much. So I do believe it's important to engage early in those discussions. And again, after you kind of come to the table with your argumentation about the value of your medicine, of your cell and gene therapy, that's really the first stage, because they could agree in the conceptual value and say, okay, I get it. I get the clinical value, the humanistic value, the social value, but I can't pay for it. So how are you going to help me pay for it? And just one example of a solution there might be standing up a reinsurance company, pooling different cell and gene therapy companies together to set up a reinsurance company to help reinsure insurance companies, especially regional plans. National plans, you could argue, they don't need the reinsurance, but regional plans might. And so those regional plans will need some type of reinsurance solution to pay for cell and gene therapy. We could either wait for that to maybe evolve over time through natural evolution, or we could be part of the solution and catalyze the development of that type of reinsurance solution.
I think that is almost inevitable. If we were Texaco and Monaco and Shell, if we were in the oil industry, you would find that we had oil rigs all drilling in the same square mile of the oil sea, of the North Sea. And that's kind of crazy. People don't do that because they have options on what the other drill sites might find. If you look at derivatives in financial markets, they hedge risk by thinking about temperatures in Colombia entering into chocolate production and confectionery in Belgium. I don't know how all these things work, but we have no Swiss Re. We have no reinsurance company, and yet we have the biggest per enterprise risks of any industry. I mean, there's big costs involved with military defense, but you've got an underwriter there. This is like military defense kinds of costs or Mars mission kinds of costs with no underwriter. So this whole concept of a regional or national underwriter seems to me to be something that we should try and get on the industry forum agenda somehow. Are you already in discussions in Pfizer about that?
We are,
Okay.
yeah, with other companies as well.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, the insurance companies are also trying to create their own solutions for reinsurance. That may or may not work. It's probably best to have a competitive market of reinsurance.
Just a question of odds and hedging. So we are actually rapidly moving through our time. There was a few things I wanted to follow up on with the audience, and I think I know the answer. Can you put your hand up if your company or institution isn't likely to have a 5 or 15-year long-term safety and efficacy follow-up requirement. Well, everybody is. And if everybody's trying to figure out their way to set this whole thing up all by themselves, that would seem as something that the industry, in terms of ARM or ARM Foundation or other collaboratives, can actually get behind and try and find a way to provide 80-90% of the requirements for long-term registry engineered and followed up, and 10% customized. So configurable elements and then customizable elements, so that there's a platform to latch onto and not have to start from scratch, and a platform that you don't have to argue for its validity from scratch. It's been somewhat certified in the future. So, and again, I'm probably unaware of any industry consortia trying to think about forming that long-term follow-up entity, but that would seem like the right thing to do. I've got a final question for everybody, so I'll just prepare them for what it would be, and it would be, if I was to, this is my magic wand, if I was to hire my magic wand to everybody in the audience, what would their wish be for progressing cell and gene therapies? Personal wishes we can keep into another forum at the bar, but cell and gene therapies. But before we go there, one of the things that, and again, I'm not a drug developer, I'm not a clinical scientist, I'm not a molecular or cell scientist, but I go to the conferences and I hear patients respond and some don't respond, and there's lots of particular wild cards. It could be the biome, it could be the immune profile, it could be the cell manufacturing process. But we as an industry do not have a data science, and this is something that really wasn't relevant before, because the time compression and the simultaneity of this data is immediate. But now, one would argue, we could actually do with a data lake, or what we call an evidence engine, that takes everything from immune profile from the lab, everything from the CAR-T manufacturing process, everything from, and linked patient by patient longitudinally, everything from either the EMR or the real-world outcome, if it's an approved drug, and then link it to buckets which aren't particularly populated yet, but link it to number of scripts written and costs applied onto payers. And this will take 5 years to build, but we can put the data structure together there. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is, and I know there's a fantastic initiative coming out of the ARM Foundation, led by Nicole Boyce, called RareX, which plans to connect all of these different registries so that will be the future state. But what we'd like to do as part of that, or in collaboration with that, is put together this demonstration project with City of Hope, where they actually have all of these elements sitting there right on that campus in Duarte, and prove that we can, well, first of all, look for correlations between those parameters and outcomes, which has never been looked for before, or it's been hard to look for before. To then try and move that to causality through some science, and then to also recognize that individual big companies will be doing it themselves, but not as a public service. And many, many more, particularly the autologous CAR-T cell therapies, are going to move into individual investigators in UC systems that buy a Miltenyi box and can find patients to treat themselves. And so this linkage, this system, if it's sufficiently adaptable to go beyond CAR-T, to go beyond City of Hope, to go into the manufacturing environment, you know, the aspiration, and there's like a 5% getting to an aspiration, but it could become a national database of how to link all elements of cell and gene before. It didn't really matter. I used to work with Pfizer. Well, it did matter, but it wasn't life critical if your Puerto Rico plant label went to a different patient for aspirin than the intended patient. But the wrong cell gets the wrong therapy, they die. And so the integration around this value chain, and I don't know if Amy's in the room, but people like Vanetti that actually cover that provenance and custody of care of the cell therapies, I think those are really interesting things to dig into, Ted. But now it's magic wand time. So here's a magic wand. You've got to hold it by this end with the shiny end up. John, magic wand. If you had to change one thing today,
Thank you.
professional, not personal, what would it be?
Well, I think building on the point you were making, I think is key, because integrated data fuels everything in terms of demonstrating the value of cell and gene therapy. And what we find is the most prominent challenges to capturing the value of the innovation we create is because of gaps in the system and inefficiencies in the system that could be corrected with better data integration. And when we do engage with the big payers and the big integrated delivery networks, you could see the contrast between the two. The payers are fighting to integrate their data in order to get a more holistic view of the patient, to follow patients over time. And under that type of rubric, we could do a much better job of demonstrating the value of cell and gene therapy. And then also engaging with them to improve on some of those value inflection points I mentioned. When you contrast that to IDNs that are already integrated, they're pretty good at doing this. They're a little bit more worried about affordability, but they feel like they can appreciate and capture the value of the cell and gene therapy, but they're concerned about how do they pay for it and how do you spread that over time. So I think the data integration and fixing, if I had to say one thing, is the interoperability of data. If I could wave my magic wand, it would be about fixing interoperability of data to enable that.
I'm going to have to upgrade your magic wand so I can make notes about what you said.
So I hand this off to George.
Yes.
So for me, it's about enabling good patient selection. Everything comes, so much of this comes down to it. It is the genomics data, it's the biomarkers, getting a good biomarker set, getting predictive, immune profiling to link to outcomes, integrating all that data together. So when you dose that person, dose that patient, you know that you're gonna, quote, AAV, you're gonna cure them for 10, 15 years, not 2 years or 5 years. Or for, CAR T, you're gonna have a 90-something% complete response rate, not a 40% complete response rate. So deep understanding of the patient, so far beyond what we've actually achieved at this point, partially because of cost, partially because, sampling, but, you're taking the blood, why aren't you doing immune profiling at all these different steps and understanding what really matters?
Thank you. Okay, so I think all of us would align behind the following, which is what, this is my wish, I think it's all ours, which is that we have truly durable responses, right? This discussion we're having today is rendered moot if these are really, truly durable responses. So we have long-term cures, not 3-month cures that then bridge to another $500,000 therapy. If that happens, all of this doesn't really, it's inconsequential. Payers will pay for it. We won't have to struggle with the evidence. But I think we know we're not there yet. We have to prepare for the likelihood we're not going to be there yet. So from that perspective, and where we sit at Be the Match and CIBMTR, we get to see a lot of efforts at standards. Basically, this is coming down to standards. Can we agree to data standards and data sharing standards? We're involved in standard setting initiatives far outside of data. It's incredibly difficult to get this industry to standardize without a mandate coming from on high. And I think we all agree we don't want to be subject to the mandate coming down from on high. So it would be preferable if we all agreed moving forward as to how to do this. But it is going to require companies that are fiercely competitive and also that are fiercely pioneering in their spirit and sort of do-it-theirself sort of people to agree that this is something that we need to back off on the instinct there. And that's, as I said, we are engaged in a lot of these activities right now. It is proven to be quite challenging. I know it can be done, especially if we take a beachhead. So we take some small bite-sized pieces of this big challenge and conquer those first, then we can see this, I think, materialize into a much broader solution. But first, truly durable responses. If that's the case, again, a lot of this is rendered moot. I don't think we're seeing it. I hope we're going to see it. We're not there yet. So in that future where it's uncertain, we're all going to have to agree to make some sacrifices to the way we would normally want to do things as in our individual roles in the individual companies.
Thank you, Eamon.
Kind of very much along the same lines here. I think the improvement is going to be incremental, but it's going to come at a very shortened time frame. But still, even with today's technology, there's significant improvements over the standard of care. It may not be to the curative stage yet, but it's clearly we're quadrupling response rates. We are impacting the number of patients alive at 1 year, which are non-traditional endpoints, but there is some improvement. So 2 things, I think. One is there's some low-hanging fruit. There's some, Adrian, I really commend your big, bold ambition of what you're doing in the City of Hope collaboration. I really think that's important. But there are some low-hanging fruit, and I think the Transcelerate model, if you're not familiar with it, may be a good example of where there's some low-hanging fruit that different parties can come together and share data that's mutually beneficial, but it's a non-competitive space. That's one. But if we can identify those, and so for example, right now there's 49 companies developing HLA-restricted T-cell receptor therapies, right? Why does everybody have to do their own companion diagnostic? Why does everybody have to do different immune profiling within their studies? Why does everybody have to compete? There's some non-competitive spaces. If we can identify those and put them into a neutral party, such as CRI or ARM or whatever, let's put them there. And the second part of that, to make that successful, is find the right legal support. You got to go through 9 lawyers, no disrespect to the legal folks in the room, to find one who really has the open mindset and solution-oriented, but importantly, you as a leader of the programs have to be willing to give up a little bit of control, have to be willing to accept the fact that external innovation is a win-win for both the third party and your company, and be ready to give up some things.
Manny, magic wand.
So first, I think this was a highly productive panel, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to share thoughts. The future belongs to the bold. We are each here through a path of molecules running through space, and we were meant to be where we are today, to champion life. No one else is doing it. And if we cede the battle on any front, humanity loses. And so my hope for the future is that we be as bold as we are in the clinic, we are as bold as we are at the bench for the patients. And that's going to involve new thinking, collaboration. We talked a lot about an evidence platform. There's a value platform that we can all stand behind. And that is a platform that suggests that we are on the side of humanity, extending, improving, saving lives. And we have ceded that dialogue for far too long. And, it's a funny thing. People talk about the costs all day long on every headline. No one talks about the tremendous benefit. No one talks about the cost, very simply, if we do nothing.
Stuart.
I really want to flourish this.
So
I make this slightly personal. I learned last night of a friend's husband actually, was diagnosed some time ago with lymphoma, and they've already been through 2 rounds of therapy, including 1 transplant. Didn't work. They're now terminal. So my wish is actually will sum up all of the wishes I think on the panel, but it's the wish for the patient. It's the wish that they have a better than 1 in 5 chance of their therapy working. They have a better than 50% chance of the therapy being available for them, that they don't have to remortgage their house to pay for the therapy. And I think the single wish is that all of these other wishes come to pass so that can be possible. Because we're not there yet, and we're getting there. We're making terrific strides, but we're not there yet. And I think if we take some of the collective wisdom here, we'll get a little bit closer and maybe offer a little bit more hope.
I did have a concluding comment, but I don't think I could top that. So thank you to the panel. And before we go, can I commit us all to try and understand what we could do collectively? We're very good at doing things individually, but
we can't solve this individually, as you've heard from the panel. So I think you'll be seeing some fora arising across the various groupings over the next year. So the time we get here, we'll have more patient foundations, we'll have more technology companies, we'll have more people that allow us to share the stuff that we can share now for the advancement of all. Thank you.